The labor process, fixed capital, means of labor, machine, fixed capital, transposition of powers of labor into powers of capital, both in fixed and in circulating capital. To what extent fixed capital, machine, creates value? Lauderdale. Machine presupposes a mass of workers. Capital which consumes itself in the production process, or fixed capital, is the means of production in the strict sense. In a broader sense, the entire production process and each of its moments, such as circulation, as regards its material side, is only a means of production for capital, for which value alone is the end in itself. Regarded as a physical substance, the raw material itself is a means of production for the product, etc. But the determination that the use value of fixed capital is that which eats itself up in the production process is identical to the proposition that it is used in this process only as a means, and itself exists merely as an agency for the transformation of the raw material into the product. As such a means of production, its use value can be that it is merely the technological condition for the occurrence of the process, the site where the production process proceeds, as with buildings, etc., or that it is a direct condition of the action of the means of production proper, like called métier instrumental. Both are in turn only the material presuppositions for the production process generally, or for the employment and maintenance of the means of labor. The latter, however, in the proper sense, serves only within production and for production, and has no other use value. Originally, when we examined the development of value into capital, the labor process was simply included within capital, and as regards its physical conditions, its material presence, capital appeared as the totality of the conditions of this process, and correspondingly sorted itself out into certain qualitatively different parts. Material of labor. This, not raw material, is the correct expression of the concept. Means of labor and living labor. On one side, capital was divided into these three elements in accordance with its material composition. On the other, the labor process, or the merging of these elements into each other within the process, was their moving unity, the product their static unity. In this form, the material elements, material of labor, means of labor, and living labor, appeared merely as the essential moments of the labor process itself, which capital appropriates. But this material side, or its character as use value and as real process, did not at all coincide with its formal side. In the latter, 1. The three elements in which it appears before the exchange with labor capacity, before the real process, appeared merely as quantitatively different portions of itself, as quantities of value of which it itself, as sum, forms the unity. The physical form, the use value, in which these different portions existed, did not in any way alter their formal identity from this side. As far as their formal side was concerned, they appeared only as quantitative subdivisions of capital. 2. Within the process itself, as regards the form, the elements of labor and the two others were distinct only insofar as the latter were specified as constant values and the former as value positing. But as far as their distinctness as use values, their material side was concerned, this fell entirely outside the capital's specific character as form. Now, however, with the distinction between circulating capital, raw material and product, and fixed capital, means of labor, the distinctness of the elements as use values is posited simultaneously as a distinction within capital, as capital, on its formal side. The relation between the factors, which had been merely quantitative, now appears as a qualitative division within capital itself and as a determinant of its total movement, turnover. Likewise, the material of labor and the product of labor, this neutral precipitate of the labor process, are already, as raw material and product, materially specified no longer as material and product of labor, but rather as the use value of capital itself in different phases. As long as the means of labor remains a means of labor in the proper sense of the term, such as it is directly, historically adopted by capital and included in its realization process, it undergoes a merely formal modification, by appearing now as a means of labor not only in regard to its material side, but also at the same time as a particular mode of the presence of capital, determined by its total process, as fixed capital. But, once adopted into the production process of capital, the means of labor passes through different metamorphoses, whose culmination is the machine, or rather, an automatic system of machinery. The automatic one is merely its most complete, most adequate form, and alone transforms machinery into a system. Set in motion by an automaton, a moving power that moves itself. This automaton, consisting of numerous mechanical and intellectual organs, so that the workers themselves are cast merely as its conscious linkages. In the machine, and even more in machinery as an automatic system, the use value, i.e., the material quality of the means of labor, is transformed into an existence adequate to fixed capital, and to capital as such, and the form in which it was adopted into the production process of capital, the direct means of labor, is superseded by a form posited by capital itself and corresponding to it. In no way does the machine appear as the individual worker's means of labor. Its distinguishing characteristic is not in the least, as with the means of labor, to transmit the worker's activity to the object. This activity, rather, is posited in such a way that it merely transmits the machine's work, the machine's action, onto the raw material, supervises it, and guards against interruptions. Not as with the instrument, which the worker animates and makes into his organ with his skill and strength, and whose handling therefore depends on his virtuosity. Rather, it is the machine which possesses skill and strength in place of the worker, is itself the virtuoso, with a soul of its own in the mechanical laws acting through it, and it consumes coal, oil, etc. Matière instrumental, just as the worker consumes food to keep up its perpetual motion. The worker's activity, reduced to a mere abstraction of activity, is determined and regulated on all sides by the movement of the machinery, and not the opposite. The science which compels the inanimate limbs of the machinery, by their construction, to act purposefully as an automaton, does not exist in the worker's consciousness, but rather acts upon him through the machine as an alien power, as the power of the machine itself. The appropriation of living labor by objectified labor, of the power or activity which creates value by value existing for itself, which lies in the concept of capital, is posited, in production resting on machinery, as the character of the production process itself, including its material elements and its material motion. The production process has ceased to be a labor process in the sense of a process dominated by labor as its governing unity. Labor appears, rather, merely as a conscious organ, scattered among the individual living workers at numerous points of the mechanical system, subsumed under the total process of the machinery itself, as itself only a link of the system, whose unity exists not in the living workers, but rather in the living, active machinery, which confronts his individual, insignificant doings as a mighty organism. In machinery, objectified labor confronts living labor within the labor process itself as the power which rules it, a power which, as the appropriation of living labor, is the form of capital. The transformation of the means of labor into machinery, and of living labor into a mere living accessory of this machinery, as the means of its action, also posits the absorption of the labor process in its material character as a mere moment of the realization process of capital. The increase of the productive force of labor and the greatest possible negation of necessary labor is the necessary tendency of capital, as we have seen. The transformation of the means of labor into machinery is the realization of this tendency. In machinery, objectified labor materially confronts living labor as a ruling power and as an active subsumption of the latter under itself, not only by appropriating it, but in the real production process itself. The relation of capital as value, which appropriates value-creating activity, is, in fixed capital, existing as machinery, posited at the same time as the relation of the use value of capital to the use value of labor capacity. Further, the value objectified in machinery appears as a presupposition against which the value-creating power of the individual labor capacity is an infinitesimal vanishing magnitude. The production in enormous mass quantities, which is posited with machinery, destroys every connection of the product with the direct need of the producer, and hence with direct use value. It is already posited in the form of the product's production, and in the relations in which it is produced, that it is produced only as a conveyor of value, and its use value only as conditioned to that end. In machinery, objectified labor itself appears, not only in the form of product, or of the product employed as means of labor, but in the form of the force of production itself. The development of the means of labor into machinery is not an accidental moment of capital, but is rather the historical reshaping of the traditional, inherited means of labor into a form adequate to capital. The accumulation of knowledge and of skill, of the general productive forces of the social brain, is thus absorbed into capital, as opposed to labor, and hence appears as an attribute of capital, and more specifically of fixed capital, insofar as it enters into the production process as a means of production proper. Machinery appears, then, as the most adequate form of fixed capital, and fixed capital, insofar as capital's relations with itself are concerned, appears as the most adequate form of capital as such. In another respect, however, insofar as fixed capital is condemned to an existence within the confines of a specific use value, it does not correspond to the concept of capital, which, as value, is indifferent to every specific form of use value, and can adopt or shed any of them as equivalent incarnations. In this respect, as regards capital's external relations, it is circulating capital which appears as the adequate form of capital, and not fixed capital. Further, insofar as machinery develops with the accumulation of society's science, of productive force generally, general social labor presents itself not in labor but in capital. The productive force of society is measured in fixed capital, exists there in its objective form, and inversely, the productive force of capital grows with this general progress, which capital appropriates free of charge. This is not the place to go into the development of machinery in detail, rather only in its general aspect, insofar as the means of labor, as a physical thing, loses its direct form, becomes fixed capital, and confronts the work of physically as capital. In machinery, knowledge appears as alien, external to him, and living labor as subsumed under self-activating, objectified labor. The worker appears as superfluous to the extent that his action is not determined by capital's requirements.